Alliance for Sustainable Colorado 2016 Hero of Sustainability, Amy Goodman, to a woman who is a true journalist. It's the type of journalism that's taught with ethics in school, but is unfortunately so seldom experienced. Thank you, Amy Goodman.
Wow, what a tremendous honor it is to be here with all of you, to be here with civic society, to also be honoring the Alliance for Sustainable Development. Sustainable has to be the watchword of the day, of the decade, of the century. If it is not, we will not survive beyond this century. I also want to thank my colleague, Dennis Moynihan, who, together with all of Democracy Now! Over the last 20 years, as well as my colleague, Amy Littlefield, and the team that has been producing Democracy Now! For 20 years now. This is our 20th anniversary. We went on the air, as John said, in 1996 on 9 community radio stations, very excited about that. And the week of September 11th, 2001, coincidentally, we went on our first TV station. We were broadcasting out of an old media center in downtown Manhattan that was a firehouse, converted to serve the community in another way, as a community media center. And when we went on that first TV station as emergency broadcasting, with the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero, stations all over the country started saying, can we run Democracy Now! We would send them out by video cassettes. The FedEx guys would come and fill their sacks with video cassettes, sort of looking like Santa Claus. And I felt it was important to send them overnight because it was breaking news. And then the NPR stations in a town would say, could we run this? And then the PBS stations. And going from 9 community stations in 1996 to over 1,400 today is a testament to the hunger for independent media, for independent voices. A testament to the hunger for authentic voices, not your typical pundits who you get that small circle on all of the networks who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues here in this room, because Colorado is rich with grassroots media. Dennis Moynihan is not only my colleague at Democracy Now! For the last 16 years, and we co-write a column together for King Features every week, which we just finished a few hours ago for this week, but also is founding a full-power FM station up in Winter Park, KFFR. Today, tomorrow, and Friday, we are broadcasting from Denver Open Media, which is also founding a low-power FM radio station. And we broadcast on Colorado Public Television on Channel 12. I want to acknowledge the remarkable gem of community media, KGNU, right in your midst. And Free Speech TV, based right here in Denver. I don't know what's in the air, though I kind of sniffed it on this 420, but it's growing some very important community media that is essential to dialogue. No, we're on a 100-city tour, and we started a week ago. We do the show in the morning. In California, we just came from about 15 cities, and we broadcast from New York at 8 in the morning, so that's 5 in the morning California time. Our crew call is at 3. And then we do an event, a talk, speak at a community media. Tomorrow we'll be supporting KGNU over at the Boulder Theater, and then we're going to Colorado Springs to do a joint talk between Colorado College and then the Air Force Academy. The cadets will come over. This is so important. And then we'll be going through the Western Slope. This dialogue that we'll be engaged in on Friday, the Democratic Dialogue Project. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they're sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. Now, I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded 67 years ago. Last Sunday, we did a big fundraiser for the first station, KPFA in Berkeley. 67 years ago, by a World War II conscientious objector named Lou Hill. When he came out of the detention camps, he said, there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. The first station, KPFA, in 49. 59 was KPFK in Los Angeles. My station in New York, WBAI, in its first year on the air, hosting a debate between James Baldwin, the great writer, and Malcolm X over the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience, the effectiveness of the lunch counter sit-ins in the South. WPFW in Washington, 1977, and KPFT. Those are the 5 Pacifica stations, KPFT in Houston. 1970. It's an unusual station in Houston. It's the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up. Yes, KPFT and the Petro Metro. They went on the air in the spring of 1970, and the Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter right in the middle of Orlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. And I thought that was a good song, but they rebuilt the transmitter, and it wasn't, well, I'd say the silver lining was that it wasn't as if Pacifica had money for advertising. It certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. They got back on their feet, and the Klan blew it up again, now with 15 times the dynamite. A few months later, as they took a little more time to rebuild, and then PBS comes in to show that moment. It's a national story. When they go back on the air in January of 1971, Orlo Guthrie comes into Houston to finish Alice's Restaurant on the air, and they go back on. Now, I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous not only Pacifica was, but independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's an uncle in Iraq or an aunt in Afghanistan, it breaks down the caricatures and the stereogroups and the stereotypes that fuel the hate groups. It makes it much less likely when you hear someone speaking who sounds like your baby or your bubba, your aunt, your uncle. I didn't say you'll agree with them. How often do we even agree with our family members? But it makes much less likely you will want to destroy them, right? That understanding about who a person is, where they're coming from, is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take it back. Now, I can't talk about Democracy Now! Without talking about my co-host, Juan Gonzalez, who's been there for all the 20 years. Juan, who is a leading journalist in New York, in this country. He actually began as a founder of the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican equivalent of the Black Panthers, organizing in New York. We went to cover a Bernie Sanders rally in the South Bronx just before we started this 100-city tour. And when I came back to our newsroom, Juan said, oh, the South Bronx, St. Mary's, St. Anne's, that's where we took over the churches to ensure that kids got hot breakfasts and lunches. And then he went on into journalism, where he has been a columnist for the New York Daily News for the past 29 years, and in the last few weeks announced he was retiring to become a professor at Rutgers. Everyone, Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, was tweeting about this, and all the leading journalists, because of who Juan is. Just a few months ago, the whole Democracy Now! Team had the privilege of going to Midtown Manhattan to watch Juan inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame, the first Latino journalist to be inducted. And, oh, his speech put all the other inductees to shame. Who was there? Charlie Rose and Leslie Stahl. But this is a little bit of what Juan had to say. He said, I figured my modest contribution would be not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them. Not simply to entertain, but to change, not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference. I've tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and famous are also victims on occasion. But they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, and even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help. I prefer the desperate unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across the unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage hopefully inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ouster of one group of politicians by another. We end our introduction by saying that this book celebrates some of the people and movements who've been making history during our first 20 years. It's not an exhaustive history, nor is it intended as a greatest hits of Democracy Now! This book is just our way of giving back by celebrating some of the ordinary heroes who've done extraordinary things to make the world a better place. And I wanted to look at 1 year in the last 20 years to talk about the movements that make a difference and how important it is that we have a media that honors them, that gives voice to them. You know, my brother, journalist David Goodman, and I wrote a book called The Exception to the Rulers. That's what all the media should be. It's the motto of Democracy Now!, but it should be the motto of all of the media. Our next one was called Static. And the reason we called it that, in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need is the media to give us the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Dennis and I who is a Denverite, and I'm very honored that the whole clan, the Moynihan clan, is here. We put our columns together in a few books, the last called The Silenced Majority. Why the silenced majority? Because I really do believe that those who care about war and peace, those who care about the growing inequality between rich and poor in this country, those who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media. Think about it. I mean, at Democracy Now!, we have grown to the largest public media collaboration in this country, I think because people trust those voices they hear going into communities, digging deep, going to the heart of the story, brought to you by listeners and viewers and readers who are committed to independent media, the oxygen of a democracy. You know, we are not brought to you when we cover war and peace by the weapons manufacturers. We're not brought to you when we cover climate change by the oil, the gas, the coal, the nuclear companies. When we cover healthcare, we're not brought to you by the insurance industry or big pharma. We're brought to you by listeners, readers, viewers like you who are committed to an honest, open media. So I wanted to talk about one year, 2011, the year that rocked the planet. And I wanted to go back to a little before December 2010. It was the year, the last month of that year, of the Tunisian Revolution. A young man named Mohamed Bouazizi who comes out of university, no opportunity, and he goes to sell fruit and vegetables in the marketplace. He's harassed by authorities, they take his scales, and he's so utterly frustrated he sets himself on fire. And that was the spark of the Tunisian Revolution. There were other things like WikiLeaks, the documents that were released, the Iraq war logs, the Afghan war logs, and the State Department cables. And those State Department cables indicated that, I mean, it's not like the people of Tunisia didn't know that their despot was corrupt. But what the cable showed was that the US knew it full well and still shored him up to the tune of millions of dollars, and it just deepened their despair. The Tunisian revolution that threw out the dictator there then launched the Egyptian revolution. Where that revolution will go remains to be seen. But what happened in that month of January of 2011 was astonishing. The whole country came out for democracy to be heard. My colleague Sharif Abdel-Quddus, with Democracy Now! For many years, Egyptian-American family, extremely illustrious, his grandfather, the most famous writer in Egypt, Hassan Abdel-Quddus. He's with us in Utah at the Sundance Film Festival. He starts getting tweets, he starts getting pictures and photographs of friends and family members saying they will die for their country. And he's saying, for Egypt? This place that has been ruled by a despot, by a dictator, Mubarak, for how long? And they're willing to die. I'm going back home, he said. I'm going to find out what's happening. And so he flew into Tahrir and didn't leave for 18 days, followed by Hani Massoud, our videographer, also Egyptian-American. He leaps tall buildings in a single bound. You want him at your side when you're ever in danger. And I mean, I think he played on the Egyptian national basketball team. He comes with his videographer and they start to bring us the voices that are fomenting this revolution. Like Ahdaf Souef, the great Egyptian writer who is in Tahrir, who wrote Map of Love, standing with two women 9 months pregnant who said they wouldn't give birth until Mubarak fell so that they could give birth to their babies in freedom. You had Nawal Saadawi, 79-year-old, presidential candidate. She'd been imprisoned and exiled by Nasser and Mubarak. She had written many books. She, even before the revolution, told young people in these salons she ran, we will win, we will win. And you met the young high school student who stood in front of the state media building giving out a broadsheet she and her other high school friends made called Voices of Tahrir as they stood in front of this media center that had spewed lies for so long. These were the people who were fomenting this revolution, coming together. Now, the networks were bringing you the revolution, that bird's eye view, which was astounding, 1 million people. The thugs had brought down the satellites, so the networks, well, they were sort of looking a little like old Democracy Now! On a kind of fuzzy Skype. I remember Anderson Cooper, the lower third, said, broadcasting from an undisclosed location. It was his hotel room. And there was Sharif standing in Tahrir saying, this is the safest place to be. And we moved from the Egyptian revolution to Wisconsin. I really think there were connections. This astounding uprising of 150,000 people in the winter of 2011. They were taking on their governor, Scott Walker, because he said he was going to bust the public unions. And this whole community came out. We flew into Wisconsin. I had never seen anything like this. In the state capitol, they occupied it. They were sleeping there. They were doing work groups there and study groups, and they were making their demands. And I saw some of the biggest guys I had ever met, the prison guards of Oshkosh. And I said to them, who did you vote for? And they said, Governor Walker, of course. I said, then what are you doing here? And they said, protesting Governor Walker, of course. And I said, why? And they said, he didn't tell us that he was going to do this. And then in front of the governor's office, where young people with long dreads, they were drumming on anything they could find. And next to them were the police rocking out next to them. Now that, I come from New York, we don't see anything like that. See, the governor had said to the teachers and the nurses he was taking on them, but not, he assured, the firefighters and the police. The problem for Walker was that the firefighters and the police were married to the teachers and the nurses. And they also understood the philosophy that, first they come for them, and if you don't speak out, next they come for you, and there will be no one left to speak out. So we covered all of these people outside in the freezing cold, 150,000 people in the snow, an older gentleman, white hair, glasses, holding up a sign that said, IRS auditors against Walker. And I went up to him, I said, are you a Republican or a Democrat? He said, a Republican. So I said, who did you vote for? Governor Walker. And he said, but, he didn't tell us that he would be going after my neighbors and my coworkers. I said, well, you have a mighty weapon there with IRS auditors against Walker. And I looked across the Capitol grounds, and I saw the Wisconsin Labor Museum. And if you think, well, what came of that? The governor got reelected, and that all just fizzled out. I think you have to think again, because movements take all sorts of forms. Sometimes they go underground, sometimes they crop up in different ways. Everything you do matters. Think about Dr. Martin Luther King, April 4th, 1968, the day he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. What was he doing in Memphis? He had simply gone there to stand with sanitation workers. Now, Wisconsin's an interesting place. It's the birthplace of the John Birch Society, co-founded by Fred Koch, the father of the oil barons David and Charles Koch. John Birch Society, a terribly racist, segregationist organization against civil rights, against Dr. King, fought integration. But it's also the home of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, 1932, founded in Wisconsin. The sanitation workers Dr. King stood with were simply trying to form a local of AFSCME. It matters what you do. Movements matter. And then move forward to the summer of 2011, when thousands surrounded the White House, that ring around the Rose Garden, protesting the Keystone XL. Who got arrested there? Naomi Klein got arrested, the great author who wrote The Shock Doctrine and This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. I recommend all of her books. It was her first arrest. Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org, he was among those who got arrested. And then a few weeks later, September 17th, 2011, was Occupy Wall Street. Thousands streamed into Zuccotti Park. Now, at first, the media didn't cover them at all. And we were in the media metropolis of the world, New York, and they were right there at Wall Street. I remember when CNN, Erin Burnett, she first went on the air with her show Out Front, one of the first pieces she did was called Seriously? Mocking the people who had taken over or had encamped at Occupy Wall Street. Now, the criticism of the media, why they ridiculed these young people, was they were saying, I mean, what do they represent anyway? Every issue under the sun. They're opposed to the death penalty, they're opposed to war, they're against income inequality, and they are concerned about climate change. And I was thinking, yeah, they're actually listening, the media. All of those things were true. But that wasn't its weakness, the movement. That was its strength. And they also said, why can't they decide on who their leaders are? It wasn't leaderless. It was leaderful. One of the placards, or many of the placards that were carried into Occupy Wall Street said, I am Troy Davis, and too much doubt. Troy Davis, African-American man on death row in Jackson, Georgia, where the death row prison of Georgia was slated to die on September 21st, 2011, 4 days after Occupy began. We raced down to Jackson, Georgia. If we could have broadcast from the execution chamber, we would have tried, because I really do think it's important that we see the images. Whether you're for or against the death penalty, we must know what's done in our name and then make decisions based on that. We couldn't go into the execution chamber, but we were allowed on the prison grounds. They allowed 150 protesters in a sort of roped-in pen. That's where the human rights leaders were, the head of the NAACP and Amnesty International, the family of Troy Davis, like his older sister, Martina Correa. What a heroine she was, there in the middle of the group in a wheelchair. Oh, Martina was a Persian Gulf Army nurse. She came back home. She struggled with breast cancer. And her face adorned every mammogram van in Savannah to get African-American women and poor women to get mammograms to save their lives, as she tried to save her own. But she was also fighting for her brother's life. I mean, she was honored in Washington along with Nancy Pelosi as a leading light. What an activist she was. But she said, it was not only her own life, it was her brother's life and the issue of the death penalty that galvanized her most. So, on that day, September 21st, 2011, Troy Davis was slated to die. There had already been 3 death warrants against him that had been vacated. This was the 4th. I'm not going to go into the whole story of Troy's case, but suffice it to say that at this point, the effort had grown to save his life that not only included the anti-death penalty activists, but also prosecutors, prison wardens, a former US president, and the Pope. This is the story of a struggle against death that refuses to die. So when we got to the prison grounds, the prison guards said we had to move over to the journalists had to move to the edge of the property. That's where all the satellite vans were. And for this moment, we hired the same satellite trucks that Fox does and CNN does, but ours was late. We were very annoyed, and we knew we were going to be relegated over. What did it mean to be with all the satellite trucks? Well, I mean, if we were going to be broadcasting all night, we weren't there to speak for ourselves, but to provide a microphone to the people who had come here. 150 people on the grounds, 1,000 students had marched from Morehouse and Spelman, and people from around the world. Our job as journalists is to go to where the silence is. Actually, it's not often that silent, but it doesn't hit the corporate media radar screen. So finally, our satellite truck pulled up, and they came onto the grounds, and they rolled down the window, and they said, "Where do you want the truck, ma'am?" And so I hadn't met them before. These were guys were working with Fox and CNN in Atlanta. And I said, oh, well, the prison guards said we have to go over. They said, no, where do you want the truck, ma'am? I said, actually, I would like you to pull up right next to the roped-in area where the protest, and they just barreled this satellite truck over to the protest pen. And then they got out, and they were bigger than the Oshkosh prison guards. And they get their cameras. The guards are moving in on them, but when they see them, they start moving back. And these satellite truck operators and videographers hand me the microphone, and they say, where do you want to stand? I said, well, I was thinking right next to where the people are protesting, and they hand me the mic, and they form a sort of protective semicircle around us. And they say, start the broadcast. And so we did. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. Now, we had gotten a press packet from the Department of Corrections. It was pretty thin. It mainly focused on Troy's schedule that day, that he would see his family until 3 o'clock, then they would clear the family out for Troy to get a routine physical. A routine physical? See, a man in Texas a little while before that had been on death row and attempted suicide. They raced him to the hospital, they got him better, and then they executed him. One other thing, being in Colorado, and the wonderful work of another independent media outlet here, the Colorado Independent. Hospira, the last US-based company to make sodium thiopental, one of the 3 drugs used in the lethal cocktail administered in most executions in this country, quit making the controlled drug, creating a national shortage. States began scrambling to keep their death chambers well-stocked. When California borrowed a similar drug from Arizona, its Undersecretary of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Scott Kernan, wrote in an email, "You guys in Arizona are lifesavers." An expose by Katie Fretland and the Colorado Independent reported that Assistant Oklahoma Attorney General Seth Branham joked in an email with a Texas colleague in 2011 he might be able to help Texas get the drugs in exchange for 50-yard line tickets for a top college football game between the University of Oklahoma and the University of Texas. Branham went on to propose in an email that Oklahoma officials, who he dubbed Team Pentobarbital, be rewarded with an on-field presentation of a commemorative plaque at a halftime recognizing Oklahoma's ongoing contributions to propping up the Texas system of capital punishment. So, we began our broadcast. It was 6 o'clock. Oh, there was one other set of papers in the press packet. It focused on what Troy Davis would be having for dinner that night. It said he'd refuse the supper that he could, decide what he would eat. So he would be fed the standard fare, and they went into detail. He said he would be offered grilled cheeseburgers, oven-brown potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw, cookies, and a grape beverage. Another page was just 4 lines. It listed the lethal cocktail that would follow. It said pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, and Ativan, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, and the potassium chloride stops the heart. Troy Davis refused the sedative and his last supper. By 7 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who hails from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves that's near Savannah, where Davis had lived. The Supreme Court denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53 p.m. A prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside. Time of death, 11:08 p.m. The eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. You know how an execution by injection works. Inside the death chamber, the prisoner is laid out, arms strapped out in a kind of Christ-like figure, legs strapped down to the cross. And then the injection, just before it begins, they pull back the curtain on the window for the audience to watch. And the audience is made up of the family of the murder victim, the prisoner's chosen people, if the prison agrees, and the reporters. The eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. According to an Associated Press reporter who was there, these were Troy Davis's final words. First, The person who was killed was a hero off-duty police officer. His name was Mark McPhail. He had gone out late one night to help a homeless man who was being pistol whipped. This wasn't disputed. The question was, what happened next? He was shot in the heart and head without even drawing his gun, the officer named Mark McPhail. Who had the gun? Most of the witnesses would later say it was a man named Red Coles. The problem with this local tough in Savannah who had pistol whipped the homeless man is that after the officer was killed, he raced to the police station with a lawyer and pointed the finger at an 18-year-old teenager named Troy Williams. Troy Davis. That's how Troy Davis ultimately ended up on death row. And that's why a former president, the Pope, the prison warden, and so many others were calling for that death warrant to be vacated. As Troy Davis was laid out on the gurney and strapped down, he said his final words, "I'd like to address the McPhail family. Let you know I'm not the one who personally killed your son, your father, your brother. I am innocent. I did not have a gun. All I can ask is that you look deeper into this case so that you really can finally see the truth. I ask my family and friends to continue to fight this fight." And then he turned to his executioners and said, "For those about to take my life, God have mercy on your souls, and may God bless your souls." The state of Georgia took Davis's body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. On Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As we stood on the grounds of the prison, just about 1:45, just after Troy Davis was executed, the Georgia Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. I was reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi reportedly answered when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said, "I think it would be a good idea." Now, that was September of 2011. Let's move forward to December, to the UN Climate Summit that year that took place in Durban, South Africa. We attend Democracy Now! All of the climate summits, starting in Copenhagen, then on to Cancun, to Cochabamba, the People's Summit in Bolivia, Durban, Doha, Poland, Peru, and then finally Paris. And we broadcast for a week or 2 full weeks, every hour, each hour that we broadcast totally devoted to the climate summits. We are the only national broadcast in this country, uninterrupted coverage, inside and outside. You know, this year was particularly interesting. It was horrifying, November 30th, the attacks in Paris, you know, that killed, the terrorist attacks, 130 people. And a lot of the national news anchors raced to Paris to deal with that catastrophe. But what was horrifying after is that as the UN Climate Summit was beginning, that deals with the fate of the planet, I mean, the Pentagon is the first to say that the greatest challenge to national security in the 21st century is climate change, climate refugees. Yet, all of those anchors left and came back to the United States. We passed them in the airport. So we were inside, and you might say, well, why do you go to all these summits? What actually gets accomplished? Why waste the fuel? Well, maybe there are stalemates, but what's most astounding is what happens outside. The thousands of people on the front lines of climate change who come from every part of the planet. The kids from the Maldives who come to represent their islands that will be submerged. People from sub-Saharan Africa who are coming to speak out and say that the desertification of a continent will kill them. All of the people who are not usually given a microphone, demanding their voices be heard. So in Durban, at the end of the summit, an unusual event took place. The World Council, the UN Climate Summit, allowed youth to address the world body. And the person the young people chose was a young woman named Angelia Padare from College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, where you get a degree in human ecology. And I wanted to share with you a few of her words, what she told her elders that day. She said, "I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all of my life. You failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The science tells us we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10. The starkest betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion." She said, there is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa, she said. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. And then she quoted Nelson Mandela, saying, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And she ended by saying, "Distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now. Get it done." And she walked off the stage, and she was followed out by all of the young people in the room. And the president of the COP, the Conference of Parties, what the UN Summit is called, said, on a purely personal note, "I wonder why we let not speak half the world's population first in this conference, but only last." She clearly had moved this remarkable audience. And the next year in Doha, I saw Anjali again. She was outside the climate summit. And I said to her, "Anjali, will you come in to do an interview with us this year?" And she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I was banned." There was outcry, and she was let back in. But it is so important to understand the power of these movements. And this is where I'm going to end, going back in time. Activism, what it means. I want to end with the story of Rosa Parks. Now, that's a story everyone here knows, the story that is told and kids read about in their books. But when Rosa died, the media got it wrong. Rosa Parks, CNN said, we were watching in our newsroom as she was being remembered in Washington before the big funeral in Detroit. They said, Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. That's where they got it wrong. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing. Right, Rosa Parks sits down the bus December 1st, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, and she refuses to get up for a white passenger, and she's arrested. 4 days later, December 5th, 1955, she goes to court, and the Montgomery Improvement Association holds their meeting to decide who will lead the bus boycott that will lead to the integration of the transportation system of Alabama. They choose a young minister who had just moved into town, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helped to launch Dr. King. The media denigrates activists, but what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? Rosa Parks had sat down on the bus before and refused to get up, as had other young women. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked with E.D. Nixon, the president, who came out of radical labor politics. He had worked with A. Philip Randolph, the greatest organizer of the 20th century, who organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the black conductors, thousands of them on those Pullman trains. They were all called George, except their mothers didn't name them that. They were called George, named for George Pullman, who owned the trains. You know why they needed to be organized. And then A. Philip Randolph went on to organize with Bayard Rustin, the black, gay, pacifist activist, the 1963 March March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Interestingly, a few years ago, right before Barack Obama was elected president, when he was running for president in a New Jersey backyard with about 100 people, a person asked him at the end of the evening, raised his hand, and said, "What are you going to do about the Middle East?" And he told the story of A. Philip Randolph being brought by Eleanor Roosevelt to meet with FDR. And he described A. Philip Randolph to FDR, the condition of working people in this country and the condition of black people in this country. And FDR was very quiet as he spoke. And at the end, he said, "I don't disagree with anything you've said, but you have to make me do it. Make me do it." And that's how Senator Obama responded to the person who asked, "What are you going to do about the Middle East?" Anyway, back to Rosa Parks, who worked with E.D. Nixon, who worked with A. Philip Randolph. Rosa Parks, who had trained at the Highlander Center, like so many others, black and white together, to strategize about how to change the racist laws of the South. Right before Pete Seeger died, he came on Democracy Now! And talked about being at Highlander, perfecting the song, "We Shall Overcome," and Dr. King coming to Highlander, and Pete sang it for him. And Dr. King, as he was walking away, said, "That's a catchy tune." And it became the anthem of the civil rights movement. But that's what Rosa was steeped in. And to show how brave she was, just go back a few months to the summer of '55, the summer of Emmett Till. African-American boy who came from Chicago. His mother, Mamie Till, wanted him out of the city for the summer and sent him to Money, Mississippi to be with his aunt and uncle and cousins. He was ripped out of bed by a white mob who said he had wolf whistled at a white woman. His mother had taught him, Emmett was a stutterer, that any time he felt that stutter coming on, to whistle. He ended up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When his body was dredged up and sent back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, knowing the worst pain of her life, her only child, did something incredibly brave. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral for her 14-year-old boy. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands streamed by his casket and saw. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated head. And they were actually published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Can you imagine if for 1 week we saw the images of war? Above the fold of every surviving newspaper, a photograph of a baby dead on the ground in Afghanistan, and we learned her name and who her parents were. And there was an article about her. If the top of every radio and TV newscast told us the story of a woman blown up in a drone strike in Yemen who was attending a wedding party, and we learned who was getting married and what this woman's name was. If everyone's Facebook wall, every tweet, every email you wrote for a week named and talked about a soldier dead or dying, for just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy Now!